that's good for little kids. I'm saying that the artwork in this book is more sophisticated, and the amount of history that students need to know is more sophisticated than what I think an 8th grader would have. Do we have any of the other images that you could pop up for me? The one with the body. Well, go back to the one with the drafting desk, where Art is sitting with the drafting desk, because I can make, there are more points to be made about this. If you've seen the book, this is at the beginning of book 2, Art's book, and you get the facts, first of all. This is the relationship between words and images. The words say, my book's been a great success. If people want to make a film out of it, and on the side here, someone say, Mr. Spiegelman, are you ready? Are you ready to film? And then there is paired with each one of those descriptions something tragic. Vladik dies. Art claims, I'm depressed. So you take a piece like this and look at it, and it's also the first time that we see the character is wearing a mask. Art has a mask on here. You're not seeing him as a whole mouse head. I asked students about this bottom panel. So what's going on here? Can you describe what's happening? Well, Art's sad because he's thinking about the Holocaust, and these are all the people who died, and it just makes him feel really bad, and that's why he's hunched over and he's sad. But there's more to it than that. The words give facts and information, but the pictures add to those words that lead students to have to make an inference, to have to make a claim. And that claim is, those pictures suggest, as the drafting table is placed on top of the bodies, Art's success is built on the tragedy of others. So there's that, and also, why do we see Art with a mask for the first time? Why? This is threaded through the book. Part of Art's problem is he suffers the experiences his parents had, but they were not his experiences. There's a certain amount of tension and guilt because he just doesn't get his father, saving bits of paper and wire, etc. So what I'm saying is, I don't think 8th graders are going to look at this piece and look at the words and the images together and make those kinds of conclusions. Anyway, that's an example of the words and the images, how they
just to follow up then, what level were you taught the book for a long time, so what?
I was teaching to seniors. When I came to Lindsley, the book was in an elective, so a small number of students were taught the book, and I eventually shifted it to all the seniors would be reading it, and it is taught in colleges too, so you know that. If you use this for 8th grade, you cannot do what I was doing with it. And I would just fear that the visual text in this format might send the wrong message to children. I wouldn't worry about the nudity. I'm telling you, I told Rabbi, I didn't even remember what was offensive. I couldn't remember what the bad words were or the nude picture. I didn't think of it as offensive. I thought of it as tragic. I was more caught up with a couple other images, and those of you who read the book probably can recall, that I think were really horrible, seeing what's done to a child. It's that's probably to me the worst image, the most painful image that I think would be tough for a child to see.
Okay, and you mentioned the effects it had on some of your students. Can you elaborate?
Yes. Some of my students, Barb Lewine, who is a West Virginia coordinator for Holocaust Studies, made some connections for me. I had a few students volunteer to interview Holocaust survivors and tell their story. And probably one of the more dramatic cases was I had a young man who, he surprised me when he said, I like to interview people, because he just wasn't as serious a student. He just wanted to kind of get assignments done. But on this one, we found a woman who interviewed him. And I found out not only did he have one interview, he did multiple interviews. And Barb invited us to take part, my student and I, at the temple in a program and presenting what we did. And my student took the work that he did. They only had to draw a one-page story. He did, I think, 4 pages. And he had her story posted up. And he talked to people, and he was so excited about what he had done, and he learned. He kept saying, I didn't know this about the Holocaust, and I didn't know that, but I knew it now through her story, not through a textbook with facts, but through her personal story. I came to understand more. And so, Rabbi, it got to be about 10 o'clock, and I said, it's a school night. I'm leaving, and maybe it's okay if you go, say goodbye to everyone. So go ahead, go on, I'm fine. I'm going to finish talking to these people here. And I think that really says something for the kind of connection that you can make with people when you understand their story in a personal way.
And, right, so in fairness, you said maybe it's too sophisticated for 8th grade. And the Tennessee board, I believe, did replace the book with another Holocaust-themed book, but I don't know what it was. Now, let's open it up to questions. I'm going to go get the microphone and see. Just raise your hand and I'll come and see. Any questions? You're going to make me one.
Just want to thank you guys for coming out. This is a great discussion. There's a section in the book, the second book, I believe, where Art takes Vladek to the grocery store, and Vladek sees an African American man, and he kind of freaks out. His reaction is mortifying, to say the least. But Art is also bewildered because he can't wrap his head around the fact that Vladek would express such, naked racism, being the victim of racism himself. And I was curious, in your guys' opinion, do you think that episode speaks more to perhaps the limits of a shared life experience of building empathy, or is this simply an isolated incident that showcases Vladek's peculiar attitudes? What is your all opinion on that?
I would say that it's one example, and there are many of them. That one is about racism of Vladek's imperfection. Vladek is not the perfect hero. He's a real person. He's a real person who has faults. And I think that's what that shows. And that speaks to Art's honesty. I think that'd be a tough thing to portray your parent, to tell that story. But he does that with other things too in the text. So I think, and I think Francoise, his wife in particular, talked about that in an interview, and she just couldn't get it. She was, I think, Art probably thought, this is my father, this is my father, but Francoise was really like, are you kidding me? So it's just one example, though.
Yeah. No. Oh, okay. This is the normal version. He took ours. No. There's a couple other sections where Art and is it Nala, his stepmother, are talking about why is my father such a Jewish caricature, right? Why is he so miserly with money? Why does he care about this? And I think again it's the same thing that Judy said, that these are examples of showing that. I think Spiegel says it in one place, like suffering doesn't redeem you, it just makes you suffer. And that kind of goes throughout the book, where his father has suffered, and the story is he suffered, and that was bad enough.
We put up, what was Spiegelman's reaction to the banning? Can we put that slide up? He was asked by the Guardian, I think it was. Keep going. There. And he sent them this bookmark that he had made. And if you go to the next slide, this is a comment he made to the Guardian in the interview. Who's the snowflake now? So he's quite a character, and I wish we had some video he's 73, he's still alive. So, can any of our panelists, here's a tough question, let's just deal with it. Draw parallels between what's happening in MAUS and things we see happening today. I know Tim Schneider can you?
Well, I think it's always convenient to present those with whom we disagree. Acknowledge the shared humanity of the person with whom we disagree, we actually have to debate the disagreement. If we just say, you don't count, then I don't have to have any reason why I disagree with you, you don't count. And I think that there is, at least in my lifetime of 47 years, admittedly shorter than the long span, I've seen a trend towards demonization that has been going for several decades now in terms of political discourse, of presenting the other, whomever that is, whatever the other side with whom I disagree is, as invalid and not worth even debating and discussing. And I think that the implication that the Jews are the mice is extremely charitable by Spiegelman, because that's not what Hitler would have, that's not the rodent he would have picked. He would have said rats, who need to be exterminated. And I think that that's the issue, is presenting everyone on another side in a generalization as not worthy of even discussing and debating. They're wrong, they have to be stopped, they have to be gotten rid of. I think we, in a society that has shifted our attention span downward, you need to say the most provocative thing you can in the shortest possible time in order to make the news cycle. And so something really horrific is what's going to get you noticed and attention. And the fact that our two-party system encourages people to move outward rather than inward towards the center on any issue, I think has led to a slow but certain trend of demonization of anybody with whom I disagree.
Anyone else? I'm going to get this one back.
I would agree with what Rabbi said. I would just add to it that it's not so much it's ideas, but it's also just denying basic humanity of others. And I think we are moving in that direction in various ways, with various groups that are deemed outside of our normal, whatever normal is, our normal understanding of what American society is and has been. And I do think there are worrying trends. I'm not predicting, because historians don't predict, but there are disturbing signs. And that as Americans, who we define as Americans, who we define as outside of that term, those who are being defined outside of it seems to be growing larger and larger by various groups within American society today, and that can't end up anything but that.
Let's go to the question we had about, it's a religious question for the rabbi. We have that slide. Keep going. There. I've forgotten the term now. He said that he had a vision, and I was hoping the rabbi could explain what this is.
What page in the actual book have, Micah?
It's page 50, 59.
that's not the same picture you have up. Okay. Ah, okay, fine. Gotcha. Parshat Truma? Yeah.
It is page 59.
Yeah, I got a Bible.
It is.
So the issue is that sacrifices are required of the Israelites, and that is the weekly Torah portion that talks about the fact that the people have to give up things that are valuable to them and make sacrifices. I think that's the reference.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone in the audience have a question? Okay.
We have not mentioned very much, is this what?
Keep talking, Chuck.
We haven't mentioned very much about the current political situation other than the one question which we're all delighted about. I have been personally told by a right winger in Wheeling that I would be on the list to be assassinated once they take over. There is a tremendous anger that is built up in the country. And it's not just in the country, it's Eastern Europe. We're seeing that in Hungary and Poland. Just Norway. Norway just had an election. One of the most liberal countries in the world. And the neo-Nazis, they wouldn't call themselves neo-Nazis. The Nazis won 20% of the vote, and now they're part of the government. So throughout the world, and we're most familiar, I am certainly, with what's going on in the U.S., we're going back to sort of the 1930s. And it seems like part of the reason is that there's such gross inequality that's developed over the last 30 or 40 years, everywhere in the world, not just in the U.S., that people, many normal people, have lost hope. They've lost income. They've lost the ability to have a positive future. I wonder if anyone has a comment about that and why it might be a global phenomenon.
Well, I can't speak to all of it, but certainly I think in Eastern Europe, in Poland, for Poland, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was a fantastic thing, because now the Poles are the heroes for supplying the Ukrainians, which is fantastic, but it also allows everyone to kind of forget that they were on the verge of getting kicked out of the EU because they are moving in the wrong direction. Much like Hungary just was repudiated by the EU. I do think that, especially in Eastern Europe, and I think this applies to this country as well, is that there's an issue with learning from history. That, we talked about how this book was viewed in Poland, that this is a real problem, because it presents the Poles as assisting the Germans, as accomplices in the mass murder. And for countries in Eastern Europe, the story was, the narrative was, we were victims of the Nazis. This is what they're taught during the Cold War, and when the Cold War ends, we're victims of the Soviets, right? That there's this, we are the victims, and that when you are the victim, there's a focus on you, there's a focus on your national story, and there's no attempt to complicate that, or to see where were we the victims, where were we the perpetrators. So, I suppose as a historian, I would say that. It's part of this. It's just an improper understanding of one's own history. That when you kind of shade out all the stuff that makes you uncomfortable or challenges your official narrative, then you can just focus on yourself, and that this leads to competition, and for sure, the idea of real differences in wealth. This certainly plays into it, but this is stuff that can be mobilized under a nationalist rhetoric, right? That drives the psycho policy.
I think also there's a comfort that comes in victimhood of saying, well, I'm not responsible for anything, it happened to me, and especially if one adds the corollary of blaming somebody else who did it to me, it's very effective at relieving ourselves of any sense of responsibility or any sense of requirement to work to change things. It's all been done to me, it's all passive. There's no accident. I mentioned earlier that the Nazis would not have presented the Jews as mice, but rather rats. not helpless little mice, but rather devious, dangerous rats. Why? Because rats steal, right? Rats don't build, they take. And that's what the Jews were. They were stealing from us good Germans. Our whole national ethos was being undermined. Rats carry disease, and Jews are a sickness threatening to pollute the rest of us. That was the Nazi ideology and propaganda to an extreme, very efficiently and very effectively, relieving the average German from the burden of having to wrestle with, why did the Kaiser side with the Austro-Hungarians and lose World War I? And the terrible imposition of the Treaty of Versailles that basically forced Germany into collapse, that then they were bitter and angry about and led to mobilization for World War II. I mean, those issues, it's much more difficult to discuss those things than to say, you did this to me, I want you gone. And I think that in our modern national world, I don't disagree with the sense of hopelessness leading people to extremist views. I do get frustrated with the blaming and the lack of personal responsibility that comes with it. When you point at somebody else and demonize them and call them the other and say they have to be eliminated, we ignore the reality that the betterment of the situation, at least from a Jewish ethical point of view, can only be achieved by having everybody work together for the betterment of all the other people with whom we share the world, not the elimination of those who I want to blame for causing my problems of the moment.
Could the Nazis been worked with?
No, not at all.
You had to be against them.
I don't think that the Nazis could be worked with. I think it's frustrating to see the German people having elected a guy who had just a few years earlier been sent to prison for being a horrible guy who tried to overthrow the government and then was democratically elected to the role, which then he abused and took over and became a dictator. But the process by which he came to power was he was democratically elected by people who were angry and bitter and dissatisfied and disenfranchised.
There you have the connection to today.
Well, I think, and I'll just throw this in, one of the mistakes made with the Nazis was appeasement. The idea that if we just give them a little, they'll take a little and they'll be satisfied. And so you have to call it out when you see it. That's my view, and I'm wondering if any of the panelists agree with that. I mean, after that, we'll let this one go because we could talk about this all day. But even Jewish leaders who were attempting to let's cooperate and more of us will live. That's mentioned in the book. That strategy didn't work with fascism.
I can only address as an aspect of the historical reality. Most Jews, particularly those in Western Europe, the Jews in Eastern Europe had been disenfranchised by their Polish and Ukrainian and Russian neighbors for generations, and were often already somewhat ghettoized, living in the Pale of Settlement from Russia, living in closed villages and communities, not being accepted into Eastern European society. The Jews of Western Europe, particularly Germany, thought of themselves as patriotic Germans. Many of them, were decorated World War I veterans. There were over 1,000 Jewish war veterans who won the Iron Cross fighting in World War I for the Kaiser. They thought, I'm a patriotic German. And so when the rules began to change in 35 and 36 and 37 and 38, long before the war started, the Jews were actively disenfranchised from certain professions and had their property taken away and were restricted in their movement and restricted in their employment and restricted in even where they could be at different times of day. They were incredulous, I think is the most generous way of putting it. No one could believe what was coming next was even an option. I don't think the Jews of Western Europe could imagine that they were going to be rounded up and killed. They thought, well, this is temporary. It's annoying, but sure, I'll go fill my suitcase and get on the train car. Wait, why is it a boxcar? Whatever, that's annoying. And then the boxcar got to Auschwitz, and they were dead. I think that people couldn't imagine that was a scenario, especially Western European Jews.
Now we know.
Right, well, that's the difference, is that it would be egregiously naive not to think that people could behave horrifically. Germany was the most enlightened, the most highly educated, the most rational thinking country in Europe at the time. And the fact that educated, enlightened, rational people did the worst thing that had ever happened in human history to that point to their neighbors was not something anyone saw coming. Now we should be less naive.
Okay, we're about out of time, and I want to thank our panel. Now, I just want to see if anyone has a concluding thought before we end.
Can I make a
Oh, there's a
comment?
question. Go ahead.
I'm a school teacher here in Ohio County. Well, I'm sub now, but I was in the school libraries, and banning any book, has always been an atrocity to me. Banning this book, which teaches, so much about the history of the Holocaust, is horrible. I didn't find anything offensive, no more offensive than these kids I have access to now. In the middle school, which is where I primarily taught for 35 years, they do not teach history. They get ancient civilization, they get West Virginia history, and they get geography. So, but in the English class in 8th grade, they do teach a novel on the Holocaust. They started out with the Diary of Anne Frank, and then they were teaching Night by Eli Weiss. This book, for me, though, even if it's an easier reading level, these kids would just be lost. I think teaching it, as Judy mentioned, in the high school would be perfect. And so, for, all these school boards, especially Tennessee, get upset about, the book for middle school. I totally agree. But the comic style of it would appeal to these, especially boys in, that are in high school, say juniors and seniors. That's the genre they relate to. And I just wondered if anybody had any comments or thoughts about why do they keep banning books? I mean, Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn are still on the banned book list. And if you've read it, I mean, that's just the terminology they used at the time, the virtually wrote. And this one, I think that the father is speaking, correct me if I'm wrong, is it kind of a Yiddish, which I think is amusing. But I think the kids could really in high school. But, because they, a lot of times, don't get the Holocaust experience in history.
Well, the Diary of Anne Frank is a popular one for middle schoolers because they're about the same age that she was. So they thought, what if this happened to you? Night by Elie Wiesel, very sad and terrible, certainly covers the Holocaust, but again in a more distant way. And The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal, also very popular for middle school age Holocaust studies. It's Wiesenthal's remembrances of the war coming to an end and a camp commandant wanting to apologize to him, to Simon Wiesenthal, for all the Jews he had murdered. And the book comes to an abrupt stop because you don't get Wiesenthal's answer. And then it's after the war, and Wiesenthal finds the commandant's mother. She finds him and says, "What did you say to my son?" And again, the book stops abruptly. And doesn't give the answer. And the second half of the sunflower is famous philosophers and theologians and world leaders saying what they would have said. And overwhelmingly, it's, oh, I would have forgiven him, I would have forgiven him, I would have forgiven him. And there's one or two Jewish respondents, a few famous rabbis, who say, I can't forgive him because what he did wasn't to me, which is a very Jewish idea, that you can't have vicarious forgiveness. But again, to a young person reading The Sunflower, it's very neat and tidy. And they go, oh yes, that was terrible, and we need to forgive and move on. MAUS doesn't give the reader that ease and comfort at all.
Diary of Anne Frank is on the challenge list. I'm not sure about
Diary of Anne Frank is one of the banned books.
I'm not sure about Night.
Not sure about Night, right? Any concluding thoughts, Judy?
Well, I think one thing, as far as what's happening now, is that I think we don't want to say that these certain behaviors or tendencies just come from one political side. I think what happens is when people are discontent, there's almost a formula. Find the scapegoat, have specified complaints and issues, and then come up with a solution somewhere along a continuum of treatment toward these people. As long as you can get enough symbols, speakers who have charisma, a movement can then get traction. And I agree with you, I don't think people thought what would happen in Germany would. I think that there were, just like now, I think there are people who don't see it. They don't see the picture.
I guess the last thing I'd like to say about this book is that you should be offended while reading it. Right? We should be offended as human beings that other human beings did this, and that if you're not offended by the Holocaust, that's a problem. And by not teaching this, by banning the book, this doesn't solve any problems. Right? Paper's over, cover's over things. Right? These are things that need to be addressed. We talk about the phrase, never again. Well, that's a little right. It happens all the time. It's happened numerous times since then. But if people are aware of this kind of stuff, I think that goes a long way. So books like this need to be taught.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.